The last moderator. Marcus Chun had built his podcast empire on a simple premise. Everyone has a revelation that changes everything. The turning point had grown from a bedroom hobby to a cultural phenomenon, drawing millions of listeners hungry for those transformative moments when ordinary people's lives pivoted on a single realization. But Marcus never anticipated his own turning point would come wrapped in yellow police tape. It started with Sarah. She was found in her apartment on a Tuesday morning, an apparent suicide. Pills scattered across her nightstand, a half-empty bottle of wine on the floor. Sarah had been Marcus's head moderator for 3 years, the one who sifted through thousands of submissions to find the stories that made people pull their cars over to cry or call their estranged parents or finally leave that suffocating job. Marcus delivered a tearful tribute on the next episode. The community mourned. Life moved forward, as it does. Then came David. 3 weeks later, David didn't show up for the weekly moderator meeting. When police broke down his door, they found him at the bottom of his basement stairs, neck broken, surrounded by old podcast equipment. Accidental fall, the initial report said. He'd been drinking, but David didn't drink. Marcus knew this. The police didn't care. When Rebecca died 4 days later, carbon monoxide leak in her garage while she sat in her running car. Detective Carmen Rodriguez showed up at Marcus's studio with questions that felt more like accusations. 3 of your core team members, Mr. Chun. Or within a month. You understand how this looks? Marcus understood perfectly. His hands shook as he provided alibis, phone records, anything to prove he wasn't systematically eliminating his own team. But the evidence was circumstantial at best. And the detective SIs held that particular blend of suspicion and certainty that guilty men must see right before the handcuffs click shut. I loved them, Marcus whispered. They were family. Family, Rodriguez repeated, writing something in her notebook. How convenient that you're the sole beneficiary of the podcast's success now. She was wrong. Of course, there was still one moderator left. James. James had been with the podcast from the beginning, back when it was just Marcus and a USB microphone in his college dorm. Quiet, meticulous James, who rarely appeared on air but whose instinct for finding the perfect story was uncanny. While Sarah had been the public face of the moderation team, James worked in the shadows, content to let others take credit. You need to be careful, James told Marcus after the detective left. They sat in Marcus's kitchen, coffee growing cold between them. They're building a case. You need protection. I need this to stop, Marcus said. I need my friends back. James reached across the table and gripped Marcus's hand. We'll get through this. It's just you and me now. Like the old days. Something in James's voice made Marcus look up. There was an intensity in his friend's eyes he'd never noticed before, a kind of fierce devotion that might have been comforting if it hadn't felt so possessive. Just you and me, Marcus repeated slowly. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat in his studio, headphones on, scrolling through old episodes. He found himself listening to moments when James had contributed ideas, suggested edits, pushed for certain stories over others. There was a pattern there, subtle but distinct. James always gravitated toward revelations about betrayal, about discovering you couldn't trust the people closest to you, about learning that love could be a cage. Marcus opened his laptop and began to dig. Sarah's social media, archived. 3 weeks before her death, she'd posted in a private moderator chat about wanting to take the podcast in a new direction, maybe spin off her own show. David had supported her, so had Rebecca. James had been silent. Marcus's heart hammered as he accessed the podcast's analytics. The back-end data that showed who had access to what. James had administrative privileges Marcus had given them to him years ago, never thinking twice about it. Those privileges included everyone's personal information, addresses, phone numbers, emergency contacts. The pieces fell into place like a revelation, like one of those life-changing moments his listeners craved. Marcus called Detective Rodriguez at 2 a.m. You need to look at James Sutton, he said, his voice steady despite the terror crawling up his spine. I think he's been killing them. I think he's been killing them to keep the podcast to himself. There was a long pause. Where are you right now, Mr. Chun? My studio. Alone. Stay there. Lock the doors. I'm sending a unit. Marcus hung up and turned to find James standing in the doorway. Having entered through the back entrance he'd had a key to for 5 years. You figured it out, James said softly. He didn't sound angry. He sounded almost proud. I knew you would eventually. You're brilliant at finding the truth in stories. Why? Marcus's voice cracked. They were our friends. They were distractions. James stepped into the room. Don't you see? The podcast was perfect when it was just us. Then you brought in others. Let them dilute the vision. Let them take credit for our work. Sarah wanted to leave, Marcus. She was going to take half the audience with her. David and Rebecca would have followed. So, you killed them. I saved us. James moved closer, and Marcus saw he was holding something, a small bottle. Pills, I saved the podcast! I saved you from people who were using you, who were going to betray you. Now it can be like it was. Just us. Pure Marcus backed against his desk. The police are coming. I know. James smiled, sad and strange. That's why you need to take these. We'll go together, Marcus. Our final episode. The ultimate revelation that love means never letting go, even when the world says you should. That's not love, James. That's murder. Is there really a difference? James whispered. When you die for someone. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. James looked toward the window, then back at Marcus. For a moment, his expression shifted to confusion, then clarity, then a deep, bottomless grief. You were my revelation, James said. The moment that changed everything. I just wanted to get back to that moment. I just wanted to matter to you the way you mattered to me. You did matter, Marcus said, and meant it. You still could. Put down the pills, please. The sirens were close now, red and blue lights painting the studio walls. James set the bottle on the desk gently, like he was placing a crown. I gave you the best stories, he said. Remember that? I gave you the ones that made people feel something real. When the police broke through the door, they found Marcus standing alone, shaking, staring at a bottle of pills he'd never touched. James had slipped out the back, disappearing into the same shadows where he'd always been most comfortable. They found him 3 days later in the old dorm room where the podcast had started. He'd recorded one final episode, a confession wrapped in the language of revelation, explaining how his love for Marcus and the podcast had twisted into something dark he couldn't control. Detective Rodriguez played it for Marcus in an interview room that smelled of bad coffee and fluorescent lights. Every great story needs a turning point, James's voice said through tinny speakers. Mine was realizing that sometimes the thing that saves you is the same thing that destroys you. I wanted to protect something pure, but purity requires sacrifice. I became what I hated, someone who betrayed the people they loved for something they loved more. The recording ended with silence. Marcus never published it. Some revelations, he decided, were too painful to share. He canceled the podcast 6 months later, unable to separate the joy of those voices and stories from the memory of what they'd cost. Sometimes, late at night, he still gets messages from listeners asking when he'll return, telling him how much the show meant to them, how a particular episode changed their lives. He never responds. Because Marcus Chun learned his own revelation, the kind that alters everything. Sometimes the most transformative moments are the ones that inspire you to become more, but the ones that teach you what to leave behind, and some stories are better left untold.